he can actually control exactly what people think. And that is our job.
Hey, internets. If you are a rational person and you have paid any attention to legacy media in the last few decades, that being cable TV news sources and various newspapers both online and off, or just mainstream corporate media in general, you might have noticed something. A lot of the narratives they are pushing are complete and absolute garbage. Just bad. Really bad. Really, really, really bad. Ranging to completely nonsensical to obviously false, and in some cases to narratives that are just downright spiteful and blatantly hateful to the people that they do not like. The propaganda has gotten so bad and so blatant that it's almost like being a sophist who twists facts into falsehoods is like some kind of freaking prerequisite to be a corporate journalist these days. And unfortunately, well, yeah, that's in all likelihood exactly what's going on. It's extremely unlikely that corporate journos are hired based on their ability to discern truth and then honestly and professionally convey that truth to the public in an unbiased or otherwise neutral manner. What's far more likely is exactly the opposite. The so-called reputable journalists are being hired based on their adherence to ideology and their willingness to use dishonest tactics in order to push that ideology. They are not hired based on actual ability, but rather hired based on having correct opinions, trademark. But of course, there is a problem. Journos generally can't get away with reporting things that are just outright, objectively, demonstrably false. At least not in a straightforward sense. For example, it would be very difficult for them to report on a hurricane that didn't actually occur because too many people in the path would notice and the lie would be easily exposed. So then, what does the propaganda machine do? It's simple really, they just have to find ways to lie without actually lying. Half-truths, spin jobs, or as I will be referring to it in this video, the Dishonest Journo's Toolbox. And so, in this video I'm going to show you how to spot the various fallacies and sleight-of-hand techniques that they use to gaslight you, starting from the easiest to understand that I'm sure many have noticed, and progressing into the more obscure or difficult to spot tactics as I go on. Let's start with the one that is probably the most obvious, mainly due to how common it is and how easy it is to pull off. And that, of course, is lying by weight, sometimes called lying by omission and amplification. This is probably the easiest type of lie for a journo to pull off. If something happens and it doesn't suit your ideology, just simply don't report it. Ignore the event, either downplay it or just outright don't report on it at all, and instead amplify things that suit your ideology, or in some cases suit the approved narrative, TN. This one's particularly obvious because you can tell it's happening by just simply looking at different sources of mainstream media. Some of them lean left and some of them lean right. And all of them will generally report on the things that make their specific political or ideological affiliations look good. But of course, to anybody who has read multiple sources of news, this is pretty obvious. But what's not obvious is what some studies have revealed and just how powerful this is in manipulating the masses. There's something that just about everybody who works in mainstream news knows about, known as agenda setting theory. And agenda setting theory is the theory that the amount of weight and attention to any given event that the mainstream news is reporting on directly affects how important the normies assume that event to be. For example, if the media decided to only report on wildfires 24/7, people would start assuming that wildfires are the most important thing in the world. That's nonsense, of course. Wildfires happen naturally from thunderstorms, often enough that there is likely always one going on. But people would still assume as such. They would still think that it's the most important thing if the media did that. This is a well-studied phenomenon. Unfortunately, a very large number of people really do just completely rely on cable TV news to tell them what is and what is not important. People just assume that, hey, it's on the mainstream news, I guess this is something we gotta pay attention to. Which ordinarily would not be that big of a problem so long as the media was being honest and reported on events based on the actual chances of those events to happen. But unfortunately, of course, they do not do this. The chance of an event occurring, in fact, has little to no relationship whatsoever to the chance of it being reported on by the Big Six, which just adds further explanation to why people who watch mainstream news are actually less able to predict and understand world affairs over long periods of time than people who do not, because people are being given an extremely skewed and biased lens on what's happening around the world. An obvious example would be stories of child kidnapping and decapitation, such as with Adam Walsh. A horrible event, sure, but the media overreported it like crazy despite the fact that the chances of something like this occurring are in fact extremely rare, resulting in families taking precautions to levels that were likely unnecessary back then. But what's really manipulative is when something like this is used in politics. For example, you might remember Gary Johnson from the 2016 presidential election. The only thing they probably remember about him can be summarized in the phrase, "my Aleppo," where he didn't know what Aleppo was. Of course, he knew what the war in Syria was, he just wasn't aware of all the details. It was a silly gaffe, sure, but the media paraded it around to the point where it was the only thing they talked about in regards to him. It was their chance to make a third-party candidate look dumb, and so they went with it and over-reported it. In hindsight, we can see how silly this was. Aleppo turned out to not be nearly as important as people were being led to believe, and the other candidates made similar gaffes, often far worse, but hey, this guy was a third-party candidate that they didn't like, so they ran with it. And the result is massive amounts of normies ended up thinking it was the only thing about Johnson that mattered. To be fair, Johnson wasn't that amazing even without the gaffe, and wouldn't have won anyways. This is just a simple example that shows how powerful giving weight to stories can be. And the thing is, those studies are publicly available, so journalists know that they have this power. And so a simple way to fight against it is just being aware that they know. The reality is there are hundreds of millions of things going on in the world at any given time because, hey, there's billions of people on the planet. And so there's billions of events happening all the time. So it will always be extremely easy for a journo to cherry pick things that suit their narrative and push their specific ideology, while of course leaving out any events that do not suit their ideology. The next thing is something that's loosely related to lying by weight, and that is propaganda embedded into clickbait. Just about everyone has probably noticed that the headline of an article is often overblown or otherwise heavily exaggerated in order to entice you to click on that article and read it, and in doing so generate spicy ad revenue and view metrics, which can then of course generate more revenue. The attention of consumers is valuable, which is why companies will pay for it. Now, at first glance, it may just seem like clickbait is just an underhanded way to farm engagement. After all, non-mainstream news sources use clickbait all the time as well. But when it comes to mainstream media, there is actually something a bit more tricky at play. You see, studies have shown that a huge number of people, unfortunately, will often only read the headline of an article and then either not read the article at all or only skim read it while keeping the headline's focus in mind, but then they'll think that they've actually been informed by it, even though all they read was the headline. This means a lot of people will just take whatever the headline says at face value, even if it's providing a half-truth of the situation that it is reporting on at best. A study on this from the American Press Institute showed that roughly 4 in 10 Americans do this. And here's the thing, journos know this. And this provides them with an excellent propaganda technique. Slip in some political hit piece nonsense in the main headline, only to clarify it later in the article, knowing full well that a very large percentage of people will only read the deceptive headline, and in the process fall for the misinformation that was implied in that headline. And any journo who does this can of course feign innocence, because hey, they clarified what they really meant in the body of the article. It's not their fault that silly people don't read the whole thing. The most obvious example of this would probably be the constant Orange Man bad headlines you might have seen and will probably see more of in the coming months. The headline will suggest that Donald Trump did a no good, very bad, very mean, unacceptable thing. And then of course when you actually read the article, it turns out to not be that big of a deal. But that doesn't matter because journos know that a huge number of people will only read the headline. And even when people do read the article, it almost doesn't matter because it becomes a case of poisoning the well. People tend to be biased in how they interpret information based on the first thing they find out about that information. So even when they actually do read the article, it almost doesn't really matter because their bias has already been set by the headline. It's a very simple and very straightforward psychological manipulation tactic. So it's very important for people to keep in mind that what you read in the headline is often just fluff. It's not just designed to entice you into clicking on it, it's also designed to tell you what you're supposed to think about it. They know that when people are clicking on an article, they're clicking on it based on the headline, and they know that those people will keep the subject of that headline in mind during the entire read, without even realizing that they've been manipulated. So now for number 3, lying by fallacious opinion. If you have ever read mainstream opinion editorials, or just watched any mainstream cable TV political pundit, and you consider yourself a fairly rational human being, you might have noticed that a lot of things that they say in these opinion editorials are really, really dumb. And well, guess what? That's probably intentional. Perhaps the easiest way to lie without actually lying is to just say something that is blatantly fallacious, and then cover it up by saying, well, hey, that's just my opinion, man. What makes fallacious opinions such an effective tool for mass manipulation is that while these statements they are making are demonstrably nonsensical, that doesn't change the fact that they can be extremely convincing to your average person. For instance, appeal to emotion, appeal to consequence, tu quoque, and the black and white fallacy or false dichotomy. All of these are bad reasoning when used as the basis for an argument, but that's not going to stop people from falling for them. And fall for them the average person does, unfortunately very, very often. And of course, corporate journos know this, which is why you see it all the time, because it's effective. And it's a perfect crime too, because it's impossible to objectively prove if the propagandist knows whether or not what they are saying is idiotic nonsense, or if they're just being dumb. They can always feign innocence and claim that it was, hey, just my opinion, man. A great example of this would be Rachel Maddow. At least half of what she says is either heavily exaggerated or just blatantly fallacious, often mixing appeals to emotion with really bad humor. In a defamation case in regards to the Russian collusion conspiracy theory, a judge ruled that her viewers should be aware of the fact that she's not actually offering any facts and is just basing things off exaggerated opinions, and therefore it doesn't count because, hey, it's just her opinion, man. An interesting alternative to this tactic that some media organizations practice is just legitimately only hire people who genuinely are not that bright, such as the case with Jezebel is a perfect example. Pseudo-intellectual midwit with a gender studies degree? Congratulations, you're hired. This is why it seems like many journos are hired based purely on their willingness to perform mental gymnastics in order to push prescribed narratives. Because, well, that's often exactly the case. Whether their sophistry is being done through weasel words or intentional fallacies, their goal is effectively the same. Another example would be Anderson Cooper, who regularly employs a tactic very similar to the Gish Gallop, which I like to call the Cooper Code, where he will fire off fallacy after weasel word after fallacy like a Gatling gun so quickly that people don't have the time to process what he is saying, and that works to his advantage. A relatively recent video where he addresses Trump's town hall is a perfect example of this. If you were to watch this video, you would see that his introduction starts off with a basic appeal to emotion, which he tries to give a thin veil of credibility by using a bandwagon fallacy on top of it, by saying many of you have expressed, which is a weasel word. He then made accusations of racism, sexism, based on neutral words like nasty, which of course can be applied to any ethnicity and any gender, but he suggests you must associate them with bigotry anyways, making his accusations completely unfalsifiable, which he then mixes in with half-truths about January 6th, and repeats unproven accusations as if they are fact. And all of these fallacies and falsehoods and spin jobs occur within just the first minute of his rant. Unfortunately, this kind of skewed garbage is extremely common in mainstream punditry. By mixing fact with opinion, they can use any number of fallacious arguments they want. And now for a brief interlude. The 3 Dishonest Journo tools I just went over are pretty straightforward and can be spotted by anyone with some basic attention to detail. Simply be aware that the mainstream news has often been cherry-picked, headlines are often misleading, and are often just trying to poison the well, and of course pundits are regularly employing intellectual dishonesty baked with intentional logical fallacies to push moronic opinions. And you'll probably be able to see through the majority of dishonest journalism. It's important to be aware that all of these tools are often combined, such as the case with Kyle Rittenhouse, where multiple sectors of the media put out nonsensical headlines, guilt by association fallacies, and amplified anything they could find to make Kyle look bad. Now, fortunately, America is not so far gone that the evidence of his innocence could be ignored in court, which is great for him, but for the rest of us, it's an important piece of media history to remind ourselves just how willing, ideologically motivated journos are to use deception to push a false narrative. There are many people out there who still, to this day, believe the fake news that Kyle was some kind of white supremacist mass shooter, which just goes to show how effective these psychological manipulation tactics are against normies who are unaware of them. But of course, we still have 3 more tactics to go over. It is now time to delve into the harder ones to spot. What I will go over next all requires some basic knowledge of something called the cathedral, something I did an entire video on before, but for those who don't know, a quick summary is that the cathedral, sometimes referred to by similar concepts such as the regime or sometimes just called intelligentsia, refers to a form of decentralized narrative collusion that exists within academia and mainstream journalism. It is critically important to understand that the cathedral is not a conspiracy theory. These people are usually not meeting behind closed doors to discuss what is and what is not acceptable. Sometimes smaller groups will do that, but it is not necessary for the cathedral to function. Rather, it is built on the backs of personal incentives and authoritative power structures. Perhaps those of you who have not heard of this before will understand it better if I just get into it and start with what is often called prestige-seeking behavior. The main incentive driver behind behind decentralized narrative collusion is that those who espouse the most correct opinions trademark are generally the ones who are promoted within academic and mainstream journalist organizations. In other words, those who bend the knee are often rewarded with greater status and rank for conforming to the dominant ideology. This is something that is just a standard reality of human society. A very easy way to climb the ladder in an intellectual institution is to, of course, align one's beliefs with the common values of that institution. Pretty straightforward. It's also important to note that under standard circumstances, this incentive structure should not be automatically regarded as a bad thing, so long as said intellectual institution retains an epistemology that maintains an interest in truth above all else. The problem, of course, occurs when the bulk of these institutions fall victim to an ideological capture by those who reject objective truth in favor of moralistic gibberish. And as it turns out, in modern clown world, this is exactly the case, as many of our institutions have fallen to the postmodernist progressive left doctrine, which is sometimes colloquially known as the cult of woke. While this ideological capture is unfortunate and explains why a lot of what corporate media puts out these days is garbage, on the flip side it provides a straightforward way to sniff out low-quality journalism, because a prestige seeker is simply one who engages in virtue signaling to show off their allegiance to the progressive regime for the purpose of increasing their social standing within these institutions. Have you ever read news or a cultural commentary article that read like it exists for no other purpose other than for the person who wrote it to show off how many correct TM opinions they hold? Well, guess what? There's a solid chance that this is exactly what was going on. Simply grabbing onto a current event and then writing up some basic commentary that frames it within woke ideology provides journos with a simple and straightforward method to create content that, while very low in effort and completely devoid of any real intellectual value whatsoever, is otherwise very lucrative for their career. The only downside to them doing this is that it also signals to us that what they wrote can be pretty much safely disregarded as pseudo-intellectual trash. If what they wrote seems like all they did was go to ChatGPT and ask it to write about X current event, while telling it that the AI should frame said event under the context of how it relates to systemic injustices of traditionally marginalized groups under the institutional oppression of the patriarchy or some other bullcrap, then there is no reason for us to take it seriously. Although I do need to point out, while it is most common for this to happen within progressive ideology, because that is the current dominant ideology of the cathedral, this does not make rightoids immune to it. There are in fact alternative, yet much smaller cathedrals that exist within right-wing circles. So small examples of this can be found to some degree on Breitbart. However, the overwhelming majority of examples of this will be found in mainstream media circles that generally either lean center-left or lean towards progressivism, where the issue is far, far more common, with almost everything the journalists on Huffington Post write as being a very basic example. Next up is the phenomena of circular reporting. So, one prestige-seeking grifter who is simply trying to boost their journo career is one thing, but what happens when multiple low-effort prestige seekers all start regurgitating each other's idiotic claptrap and accidentally end up reporting something that is totally false? Do they admit that what they reported was totally false? Of course not, because that would delegitimize them. And so they double down and keep on circulating the false report, until it is basically canonized as truth. In other words, you get circular reporting. Once the tune of the correct opinion dance has been set, the journos will all start to copy each other, resulting in multiple media sources producing eerily similar headlines, all with identical direction and narrative. What's interesting about circular reporting is that it can often be difficult to trace where or who exactly the narrative originated from, because often several different components of that narrative will spawn from different sources before the canon is finally amalgamized into its final form. But in many cases, there's often just one source that they're all mindlessly regurgitating, and they don't even realize that there's only one source that this all originated from, and yet they circulate it around endlessly anyway. Circular reporting is probably best understood, however, by the example of Gamergate, a case in extreme circular reporting that is so crazy it's still going on to this day. Seriously, the Washington Post recently posted an update just 2 months ago circulating the approved TM narrative once again that Gamergate was nothing more than just a targeted harassment campaign by hundreds of thousands of trolls who just decided for no good reason to randomly harass some whammon on the internet, and it's nothing more than that. This narrative can be found regurgitated on dozens of online mainstream news sources, and it's completely bunk. Anybody can disprove this narrative very easily by just simply doing very basic research on the pro-Gamergate side. Either through Kotaku in Action or the Gamergate Deep Freeze wiki, you'll find that Gamergate actually had very little to do with harassment, and rather the harassment narrative comes entirely from a fallacious grift, where criticism of an individual individual's actions are conflated with harassment of that individual, which of course is a faulty argument because criticism and harassment are objectively not the same thing. I've already made a pretty big video on this a long time ago, so I won't go further than that, but the basic gist of it can be summarized on Deep Freeze's wiki, where they state, Gamergate is a hashtag and consumer revolt of gamers around the world that began in August of 2014. Hashtag Not Your Shield is a sister hashtag, created to lend a greater voice to female and minority gamers who supported hashtag Gamergate and who were dismissed and ignored by the games media. Beginning in 2014, the video games media, spurred by a scandal involving one of their own, launched a vicious attack on gamers and gamer culture. Their goal was the self-professed slander of gamer as an identity and the pushing of a social justice political agenda into the world of video games through cronyism, censorship, and collusion within the video game trade press and mainstream media. So how on earth did such a false narrative end up getting circulated so hard? There are many reasons why, ranging from it benefiting certain powerful organizations, as well as support from coming high up from the government. But a big one is simply that false narrative is again very lucrative to the career of the prestige seeker. Defending a disenfranchised minority against harassment serves as major bonus points within progressive thought. So it didn't matter to these journos if what they were writing was true or not. It was beneficial to their position and rank, and anyone who stepped out of line and refused to regurgitate the narrative and help circulate it was of course falsely accused of helping that harassment to exist. And the reason prestige-seeking behavior often results in circular reporting is, again, the lack of any real effort put into checking their facts, along with the strong personal incentive mainstream journos have to not go against the cathedral because they will definitely cancel each other and go at each other like a pack of hyenas for those who dissent. And so you end up with a bunch of talentless hack journos who just echo what all the other cathedralites are saying without actually doing any real investigative journalism on their own until they are all basically just repeating the same false narrative. The important takeaway from this is that just because you see a story being circulated on multiple sources doesn't make that story true, especially when that story is grounded in woke ideology and unfalsifiable accusations, or things that otherwise cannot actually be proven or disproven objectively in any way. Now, the last tool of the Dishonest Journo toolbox that I'm going to go over here is one that's very easy to understand, but can be very difficult to spot and prove, and that is bunk studies and misrepresented research. An unfortunate reality of the cathedral is that prestige-seeking behavior affects academics as well. There's a very strong personal incentive to push academic research that agrees with the woke narrative, as blind obedience and adherence to the progressive woke ideology can in fact be very lucrative for an academic's career. However, there's a very important thing that needs to be pointed out here. Most of the time, science can be trusted. The main issue is the difference between the hard sciences like physics and engineering and soft sciences like social science and psychology. Hard sciences can be generally always trusted because there exists measurable, verifiable results. For instance, an inventor of a new engine must eventually, actually physically produce that engine, and if it can't be made to perform to specifications, then well, there is likely something wrong with his theory. However, with the soft sciences, this kind of check unfortunately doesn't really exists. The closest thing to it would be replication. For instance, in a study of about 170 replication attempts, over 50% of social psychology papers couldn't actually be replicated, which is a very big problem because a lot of times social psychology as well as sociology papers tend to cite each other a lot. So if a huge bulk of the social sciences are basically nonsense and can't be replicated, and they're constantly citing each other, then there's a very good chance that everything that you're reading from them either is bunk or cites something that is bunk. So yeah, a lot of it is just nonsense which is used to justify an idiotic agenda. However, to truly know if a study is bunk or not does in fact require a lot of genuine research and the ability to read through academic papers, which isn't as hard to learn as it sounds, but it is something you may want to look into if you really want to be able to see through the more complex journo scams. Fortunately, what makes this slightly easier is that what's happening most of the time isn't so much that the research itself is bunk, but that the journo who is citing it is actually cherry-picking it or misrepresenting it in some way. There are a few ways the average person can spot this. First off, if the journo does not tell you the name of the study and instead just says some lame weasel phrase like, studies show, just trust me bro, then you have every right to be suspicious. It's probably nonsense. If the research is not open and publicly available, it could really say anything, because again, the first three journo tools let them lie using fallacious opinions or only citing a cherry-picked portion of the data that agrees with their prescribed narrative. And yes, they will often do this even if the the study as a whole actually disproves what they're saying about. So second off, sometimes journals will try and pull what I like to call the "this apple is an orange" scam, where the data blatantly says the opposite of what the journal was claiming it said, and this is unfortunately a lot more common than it should be. So for the average person, I would just follow these 3 guidelines. If it's soft science, and if the study is not publicly available, and if the study is being used to push woke ideology, there's a very strong chance that it's bunk. So then, what conclusions can be drawn from all of this? Well, it's important to remember that the corporate media can only get away with being dishonest about certain things. A lot of people, when they learn just how common it is for the media to be deceptive, often go down the malignant rabbit hole of trusting nothing and rejecting all empirical data, essentially becoming an everything is fake schizo who believes in stupid crap like the reptilian conspiracy or flat earth or whatnot. When you watch or read the local news, the reality is most of what you read in terms of weather reports, traffic accidents, new scientific discoveries, and local events and whatnot is generally true on a surface level. So long as you don't spot any of these dishonest journo tactics, you can usually safely assume that the basic information is correct. But we must always keep in mind that the mainstream media does indeed kinda suck. They regularly refuse to question state narratives coming from 3-letter agencies that have a proven track record of lying, which is not surprising because the vast majority of corporate media is owned by 6 companies, all of which have a revolving door relationship with the state. And on top of this, the hold of progressive woke ideology perverts an already corrupt system even further, which just gives additional credence to the theory that much of what we see from corporate journalists is in fact a very carefully constructed narrative designed to keep some very unpleasant people in power. Anyways, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, tip me on Ko-Fi and all that, or follow me on Twitter, or X as it's now called. Till next time.